Welcome. My name is Belén Vidal. I'm a reader in film studies here at King's, and I'm really excited to welcome you to this event of high-dimensional cinema. The goal of our discussion today is going to be addressing the way AI is reshaping our understanding of visual culture and is interacting with cinema and the moving image in particular. So this event is an initiative of the Department of Digital Humanities and is also held under the auspices of the Institute, Digital Futures Institute. And first of all, I would like to introduce actually two speakers who are going to tell us a little bit about the Digital Future Institutes, Marion Thain and Steve Connor, who are co-director and director of research, respectively, and they'll tell you more about this.
Thank you so much for that. This is a great topic for an event, and you've got some wonderful, wonderful speakers, so it's a great pleasure to be here. Just to say a little bit about how the Digital Futures Institute came to be. It's trying to answer a need that I think is felt very, very strongly at this moment. You all have heard the global tech leaders coming out and saying we've got to pause the development of AI. They're saying we've got to pause the development of AI not because we can't code well enough, but because we haven't got the frameworks around AI sufficiently developed to ensure that it's a social good, an individual good, a human good. And so I think that really points the way for this intersection between the humanistic and the humanities and technology that we desperately need. The world desperately needs this stuff right now. And of course, at King's, we have, arguably, in my opinion, the best digital humanities department in the country, the world. Don't want to offend anybody. Say the country in honor of our guests from elsewhere. So we have fantastic expertise in this area, in the digital humanities department, also right across the college, quite frankly. So we've got a huge opportunity. The Digital Futures Institute was created to try and harness that opportunity, to think about technology in new ways, in interdisciplinary ways. And I think there are three sort of unique features, if you like, of what we're trying to do in the Digital Futures Institute. And one is to really get away from the binary yay, nay technology debate, where you either have to be gung-ho, tech-bro into the latest development, or you are a hand-wringing doom merchant about technology. We want to try and forge a middle ground where we can have sensible conversations that are suitably aware of all the dangers and problems, but are nonetheless also suitably cognizant of the opportunities. So that's one thing we're trying to do to get into the national debate in that way. The second thing is that we want to reframe what have previously been thought of as really technological problems that require technical fixes, and say, actually, no, these are human and social problems that require much broader ways of knowing and thinking. We can't just throw more code at it and hope that that in itself will solve the problem. We need people from arts, humanities, social sciences, law, policy, all of these areas to come together around technology to think about technology in a more holistic way. And then finally, I think for the Digital Futures Institute, it's really important that we're thinking about technology in the broadest sense, and also thinking about this historically. So we're thinking a lot about how our digital futures can't be imagined and can't be constructed well unless we think about the past and how new technologies of the past have landed, what we've done with them. And that might be the plow. You know, it could be anything that was a new technology that changed the way people did things. So that's just a little potted, in a nutshell, that's what we're trying to do in the Digital Futures Institute. Everybody in King's is part of the Digital Futures Institute. If they want to come and get involved, we're going to be advertising lots more events, we're going to be funding lots more events that brilliant people around the place are putting on. So I hope to see many of you again soon. And with that, I'm going to pass over. Steve Connor is the Director of Research at the Digital Futures Institute and has promised to fill in the bits I've missed.
Thank you very much indeed. I don't think I need this. I do this for a living, as Michael Caine used to say. But I just wanted to say how exciting it is to be here for this topic in particular, because it does seem to me, in ways that you might be able to intuit from what Marion has already said, is very much our understanding of what we want to explore, what we want to make available for thought in thinking about our digital futures. coming up for 54 years ago, I was allowed to stay up to watch the moon landings. And we, the world, were completely convinced in July 1969 that this was the beginning of a new age, a future of space exploration. And it wasn't. It was the beginning of the end. For the time being, perhaps it's about, that beginning is about to begin again. So you never quite know where you are historically with these things, but you certainly need to get your bearings historically, which is one of the things that we look forward to doing in the Digital Futures Institute. And here's one of, it seems to me, one of the strange and distinctive things about what we call digital technology. That so much of what is digital technology is in fact perfectly familiar to us, quite old technology. But unlike bronze, or steam, or electricity, digital technology tends not so much to produce new kinds of technology that sweep the old kinds of technology away, but rather to change our relation in rather a conservative yet also transformative way to existing or inherited technologies. And what you're going to be talking about tonight is a very good example of just that. And just as the exploration of outer space in 1969, as seemed in prospect, turned into the exploration of a kind of inner space of communications that nobody had any understanding was about to erupt into the world, whole new possibilities of communication and community that came into being. So digital technologies open up, to unashamedly steal your rubric for tonight, to open up new dimensions in our existing technologies. Cinema, not least. Cinema, that most, perhaps, arguably the only art form actually invented in the 20th century, is being radically reinvented, like a lot of other arts and technologies. We have inner space in the Digital Futures Institute. I'm getting excited now, time for me to stop. Like the TARDIS, we have our inner spaces. We broadcast on 4 channels. We have a Centre for Technology in the Body. We have a Centre for Attention Studies, directed by Marion Thain. We have a Centre for Digital Cultures, and we have a Centre for Digital Legal Studies. So far, because the space of the understanding of our digital futures is internally expanding in something of the way I've been talking about. So it's very exciting to be here tonight to join you for this event. Very, very glad indeed to be able to play a part in supporting it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So what we're going to kind of be discussing here today is, a wonderful panel, put together by Daniel Chávez Heras, who's kind of the organizer of this event, but also maybe worth mentioning that this event is part of a 2-day-long discussion workshop on sculpting time with computers, in which kind of several specialists who are working from different disciplines are been discussing the question of computational moving images and how to work with moving images from computational approaches. What is really rich, I think, and exciting is, the 3 speakers have they all do cutting-edge research at the intersection of cultural and innovative digital technology. So they're going to kind of present for 10 minutes each on aspects of their research, and also what is most important and enriching today is that we have a discussion afterwards on the kind of aspects that they raise. So I'm going to kind of introduce, without further ado, kind of the first speaker, Nanne van Noord, who's assistant professor of visual culture and multimedia and the multimedia analytic labs at the University of Amsterdam. And you're working with multimedia analysis and visual culture, right? So, okay, so yes. I don't know if you may. Do you want to try without using the mic or using the mic?
used to have a mic. No, there used to be, but no.
Yeah.
Are you okay with the...
This is gonna pick
actually, yeah, this is gonna pick you up, I think.
Yeah.
Here you go. Is it, you want to test?
Yeah, put the slides in it up. Then.
Yeah, forward and
Right.
backward.
Yeah, perfect. Right. So let me just jump right into what I want to talk about today. So like as a computer scientist, one of the things we try to do is analyze the material that we have, and that involves a lot of sort of trying to operationalize concepts that we have. And that isn't always easy, because what does this mean to look at a film? What are the things we can see if we look at visual material? And the things that we can do very easily are like objects and things like that. So this is a scene from a movie, and we've drawn a box around things that we can recognize here automatically. And there's many cups, there's a bunch of ties, there's a bunch of men, even in the background blurry. Like, this works kind of well, but it doesn't really say anything about what we're actually seeing here, right? It just says there's cups here, but adding one more cup or removing one cup will not change the meaning of the scene very much. So there's some deeper layer, and in computer vision we often draw this analogy between like how humans look at something, where we have some visual input that goes into our brain, and then we come out with some sort of categorization or some sort of interpretation. And I think what you saw in the previous slide is sort of the most literal interpretation of this, where like we see something, we see cups, people, ties, so let's try to describe that. But I think there's a lot more happening in a scene that we're not really touching upon. And the idea in computer vision is very much that you try to do this alignment problem. So you have some visual inputs, you have some semantics that you know about the scene, and then we try to align those. And this very simple implementation of like, we have our black box, is all like technology that we have. We put something in, an object, in this case an apple, and then we can say it's an apple. But there's many more dimensions to apples, what they mean. Maybe the color means something if you're telling a particular fairy tale. So these things all matter. So what we're trying to do is trying to add these dimensions. And one of the ways to do that is to look at the combination of text and visuals. But again, a lot of the standard data sets don't really go that very deep on the meaning of these things. So here you see some sentence descriptions of the different images. And they're all very literal. They're all just like, well, there's a bunk bed here with a narrow shelf sitting underneath it, which says something about this image, and it's factually correct. But this might also be the child's bedroom of somebody, and that gives it a different meaning, because maybe they grew out of this bed and now they're looking back at this picture and they have fond memories how they bumped their head against something. Like, there's all kinds of dimensions that we're not capturing, which we would like to capture. And to illustrate that, we can also more emphasize this problem here, where objectivity is kind of the thing that computer vision chases after. And the way objectivity is kind of determined is that using some kind of service, different people are asked, describe this image, and they're giving some instructions, and then maybe 3 or 5 people give a description, and then they pick one that kind of overlaps between all of them. And then we say, this is the objective description of this image. But of course it's a very small sample, it doesn't really give us much of the complexity, and we don't really know anything about the people that gave this description. Like, did they do horse riding themselves? Are they familiar with different types of horses? Or do they really dislike animals? I don't know. Like, I don't know anything about these people, and that does influence how they might describe this image. And I think films are a nice way to illustrate that, because you have this very recurring things that you might see in films. So if I give you this sentence, you can start to imagine what this might look like. And different people in this room will imagine this differently depending on what kind of setting you think of, what kind of people you think of on a rooftop. So one interpretation might be this. 2 people on a rooftop having a conversation. They're not even looking at each other, but they are talking at this point, and you can see the city in the background. But you have a similar scene in The Matrix, where it starts from this top-down perspective and then zooms in. And again, they're on a rooftop having a conversation. So it's the same thing, but a lot of factors influenced how this thing came to be and how they now look this way. And for me, it's very interesting to think about, we have these semantics, but we also have other aspects that come into play that determine what this may cause this to look in this manner. So in this work that we wrote together with the Canal Lab, we thought about that there's kind of 4 factors that we can broadly say that have a big impact on the way culture is depicted. And we're not in any way saying that these are the only 4 or that these cover everything, but we found that these are things that we see again and again over projects, over different things that we do, that we run into these. And I kind of want to break each of these 4 down by going with some examples. So if we think about subjectivity, I think what we established that it's very much a relational thing. So a lot of things may have a certain meaning because of other people's opinions about it, or maybe they don't match with yours. Maybe you like a certain movie because it was recommended to you by somebody that's very dear to you, and that gives you a different meaning than what you would have had if you saw it yourself. Similarly, knowing the historical background of the bottom film might give you some more interpretation of what this film means, rather than if you go into it naive, not knowing what is depicted. And what we now see is that frequency is often the thing that is used. So rather than saying this is the different viewpoints, rather we're saying, well, this is the majority viewpoint that most people have, and we ignore everything else, which loses this relational aspect between the viewpoints. And that's something where we're trying to say, okay, can we bring this back into the system? Can we look at different viewpoints and then compare how they might relate to each other? Similarly, you have a point around scale. So in the sort of traditional humanities, it was the idea of like close viewing, where you, as a scholar, you look at something, you form your opinions. And then sort of the digital alternative to that became distant viewing, where we look at a lot of material, automatically, we don't see anything up close, but then we draw conclusions over the whole. But we feel there must be something in between here, where these things influence each other. The way you look at something from up close influences how you might interpret the bigger collection analysis. And similarly, so here we see 2 versions of The Wicker Man, which one is a recreation of the other one to some extent, but there are some differences. So the way you would interpret this film is shaped by this film. So again, you sort of get this relational aspect in there, but you also want to have this thing of like looking at it over larger data, but also zooming in on specific cases. And interestingly, for example, in the top one, you see in V for Vendetta this tribute to this other film. And it looks like, okay, might be interesting. And actually, if you go to look online, you see that people try to find that film, but it doesn't actually exist. But knowing that it doesn't exist, it helps you interpret this film. And if you just take it as sort of like this distant viewing approach, where we look at all the references to other films, we might take that as being a reference to another film, where we would rather say, well, we know that this is not an actual film. So there's all these complexities and layers that we add by looking across different scales that we don't really know how to do yet, but where we feel that these are aspects of culture that we want to incorporate. We also have these points about the contextuality. So a lot of cultural artifacts obtain their meaning and significance from where they come from, how they are shared, and also how people perceive them. Marvel movies, for example, are fairly highly grossing movies, but there's also a lot of critique on them as being not maybe artistic enough, or these like different critiques. So you have this sort of contrast where it is popular, but maybe not critically well received, and that shapes a lot about what we think about them. And if we just look at them objectively with some algorithm, we won't touch upon these layers, and we can't really say what's going on, what does this movie actually mean, and how does this shape the genre that is happening there. So again, more layers that we try to add and we try to investigate. And then lastly, and I think that's something that we touched upon today in the workshop also a lot, is this aspect of temporality. And this touches on many different concepts. So you can think, for example, about technical aspects of filmmaking, is the fact that early films were in black and white, but then they tried to add certain things to it by tinting the material in a certain color. So this may be yellow might signify something, and similarly, if they made it blue, it could be that because it was night. So these are things that we would like to know about the film to understand better what's going on, but it also interprets very much what we can say about a film. So if you think about early films, the cameras were very big, which means that they couldn't really move them around. But it doesn't mean that it's part of the director's style to not have a lot of motion. It was simply that they were technically not able to introduce this motion. So then we need to disentangle that from the fact that they couldn't do it versus they didn't want to do it, which changes our perception of director style. So again, there's like these very difficult aspects to this complexity, and this also, of course, happens a lot in language, where we might think of certain terms that have reached a certain significance. So especially around, like certain more like queer, for example, is a word that has changed a lot in meaning over time, and that shapes the way we think about this term. And I think the same thing happens in films, where over time they reference each other, and that shapes certain styles. So I know I presented a lot of like different layers, and I think for us that leads to a lot of different questions that we are not able to answer yet. But I think the main point that I wanted to make is that there are actually all these layers, and as computer scientists we're now sort of trying to unravel this and see what's going on. And this actually leads to many more complexities that we don't know how to deal with. But I think that's sort of part of the fun, is trying to see how can we actually unravel these things, and how can we come up with this interaction between the humanities and computer scientists, where it isn't just all existential doom and words. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanne. Our next, I clicked this. I don't think I need this, but anyway. Our next speaker is Mila Oiva, who's a senior research fellow at Tallinn University. She's a cultural historian working at the Kudan Open Labs for cultural data analytics. She focuses on the circulation of knowledge in kind of in long-temporal perspectives, and she's going to be talking about a case study around Soviet newsreels, I believe. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Take it away.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I don't know.
Okay, so I will actually continue from this kind of like, I think Nanne, you brought us a very beautiful kind of like wide like perspective, and I will dwell on mostly on images here, and I will be talking about exploring Soviet newsreels with computer vision. So, as I already told you, I'm coming from cultural data analytics at Tallinn, and I have been for the past year or 1 year and a half researching newsreels together with my colleagues and Daniel. As many of you might know, newsreels were approximately 10-minute long news films that were shown in cinemas before the main feature of the evening in the 20th century. So that's kind of like historical data, historical news data that we are looking at. And in our studies, we have been exploring mostly Soviet newsreels and also newsreels made in Estonia. We have been doing several different kinds of explorations, and we also acknowledge that film is more than only images. So there is sound, there is film like image dynamics, there is music, there is spoken word, there is text in the images. So there are all these different kinds of layers within the image or within the film. But today I will be focusing on images. My background is in cultural history, and I'm mostly interested in newsreels as depictions of historical culture, historical political situation and such. So I'm not a film scholar as such. Here I will be, in this presentation, I will be talking about, based on one newsreel series that was titled Daily News, Novosti Dня. It was produced by the Central Documentary Film Studios in Moscow, starting from 1944, and we have, the collection reaches until 1992. And what we have done, so we have extracted central frames of each shot, and we are operating on these frames with this research. Often in film studies, when people want to study images, as already also touched upon by Nanne, people often do annotations and annotate what is visible in the images. Here is a kind of like a toy data set of images. It's very simple, but here I think it's also kind of like illustrates how difficult it is to work with this kind of like annotations, especially if your interest is to kind of like grasp the whole. What are these kind of like all these different features that are within these images? So I think that if you already have a particular research question in your mind, if you are interested in, for instance, depictions of technology, then it is a very good approach to use these like annotations and categorizations. But if you have kind of like broader interest in understanding what this whole data set actually consists of, to understand what is there, so then using these kinds of annotations can be problematic. You are not often maybe able to categorize everything either by color or by shape, or you kind of get only partial view to all these different features that are within the images. And this easily also leads to emphasis on deduction. So you start to study only those things that you already know of. But what if you don't know what's there in those pictures? So then it's, you might lose some of this information. Our research group, we have been trying to solve this problem by using convolutional neural networks, and namely ResNet50. I'm not going into very detailed description of this technology, but this is basically turning images into multi-dimensional vectors. And each of these dimensions represent one kind of like visual feature of those images. So it could be certain color, it could be certain angles, certain dimensions, and such. And then, because of course, as a humans, we can't really understand multidimensional depictions, we then convert these multidimensional vectors into two-dimensional projections, such as UMAP, TSNE, and so on and so forth. So, for example, using our data set, the toy data set that I showed you earlier, these are two toy examples of different projections of the different kinds of similarities within this data set. So in our research, we have been using a tool called Collection Space Navigator. That was, it's an open source, openly available tool developed by my colleagues at Fudan. So here is there is a link to the code and test set as well, so where you can also test this by yourself. With this tool, these are so different kinds of projections of these multidimensional embeddings of these images, and you can see, I don't know, maybe it's not very well visible, but there are kind of like the idea here is that images that are similar to each other tend to group to the same corners, while those images that are very different are in kind of like distant to each other. So, for example, here is a close-up of an image where there is kind of like horizon, and usually something standing on the horizon. So you can see several similar images grouped together. And then we have a close-up. This is a little bit fuzzy, but there are a lot of men wearing black suits. And you can see Brezhnev there as an example of a man wearing a black suit. So this is kind of like, you can already feel what was the contents about in the Soviet newsreels. So we chose one of these projections into closer analysis. This is the UMAP projection. And it's kind of like very interesting for me to see what types of images were shown to the Soviet newsreel audiences. So there is a kind of like in the bottom part of this shape, there are mostly like images of persons. There are large groups in that corner, and then close-ups here, and then in the upper parts there is a clear cluster of different kinds of depictions of nature. There is city images, of course, a lot of Kremlin, and then there are titles and some kind of like a huge cluster of industrial production. Thanks. But that's not the only thing that we can do. We can also explore the temporal development. Here you can see you can either look at the temporal development of all these different clusters within certain time frames, or in this direction you can look at what kinds of depictions or visuals were shown at the beginning of the newsreels, what at the kind of like middle frame, and what were shown at the end of the newsreels. What is very interesting here is that if we look at this last column here, are visuals starting from 1985 until 1992. So what I call this particular interesting peninsula here, for me it's this Perestroika problem. Yeah, I will talk about it a little bit later, but here, just to illustrate a little bit more, so there are, if we look at the beginnings of the newsreels, there are, again, a lot of important people, men wearing black suits, while at the end there is a lot of sports, children, and so on and so forth. So you can already see what kinds of structures they were within the newsreels. But this is the Perestroika problem that because this is an ongoing research, this is something that I need to focus on more and really study whether there was this certain concentration of these Perestroika images because of certain features, maybe posters of people there, or maybe there is a kind of like stamp somewhere that was put there in the latest phase, and it necessarily doesn't have anything to do with Perestroika. But to conclude, so I think this is kind of like using these convolutional neural networks provides a way to study images with the acknowledgement of the multi-layeredness, multi-dimensionality. It doesn't provide separated categories, but sliding degrees of similarities. And sometimes these make sense, but of course there are also certain things that for human viewer, kind of like, I don't necessarily understand that. So, and the user then, of course, as I showed you, we have selected this certain one projection and analyzing that deeper and trying to understand what it is. So I think that it's kind of like providing new glasses for me to look at the data and to try to understand it. But the work, of course, continues. And here is just the link if you want to test the collection space navigator together with part of the newsreel data as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mila. And finally, last but not least, we have Daniel Chávez Heras, who lectures here at Digital Humanities at King's. And Daniel works on, actually comes from a background also in the history and theory kind of cinema, which, and also creative and scientific computing. He's particularly interested in applied machine learning technologies. So I think his talk is going to go around this.
So thank you all for coming. Okay, so I think this is we obviously planned this very well because this is going to fit, I hope, with the previous two. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a different aspect, I suppose, of this type of work. So this is related to a particular piece of research that has just been published. What I'll do is try to do three things. I'll do a little very fast paper summary and some examples, but I want to focus more on modalities of inquiry or styles of doing this type of work, and then finally maybe touch on the applications and implications of some of these things. So just to begin with a brief summary of the paper. So the idea for this paper came about as I was reading some of the both kind of fantasies and anxieties that people have placed on AI technologies, specifically in this case on kind of neural computing types of technology. So this is a quote from a film scholar who's really interested in supercuts. For those of you not familiar with the form, so I mean, I assume many of you will be, but these are just mashup clips that you can find on YouTube that use supercut. I'll show you an example of it so we know what we're talking about. But I read this passage that Reb knows, so the supercut is, and I think quite telling of the sorts of things that I want to discuss, is that it's not simply a mode of editing or a type of editing or a style, but it's actually a mode of thinking that is expressed as a mode of editing. So so this type of knowledge about, deep knowledge about media, which I suppose is alluded to in the previous talks, has to do with ways of thinking about media, but also ways of doing things with media. And so one of my interests, obviously, is in learning through doing and in what critical technical practice as a modality. So then we have another take from a different theorist who also was a lot more fearing of this kind of technologies, so saying that in the near future they will essentially be useless because you can just feed the algorithm with keywords and other elements which would automatically generate a perfect supercut of media content of any kind at the blink of an eye. So this is like a very typical example of how theorists read into these technologies, some of them hopeful, as Marion was saying earlier, some of them really fearful, so some of them thinking that they're going to be out of a job, and some of them thinking that it's actually going to give them a different type of job and so on. But what interested me about both of these cases is that they were both knowing they both considered that there was a possibility of having automated supercuts. So naturally what I tried to do is to put that to the test, and I built an automated supercut system to try to see whether it was feasible, and second, whether it made sense for some of the arguments. So just so you get an idea of what a supercut is, so this is from another lecture at King's, but incidentally it's a really good lecture, so I don't want to, it's not meant to be a criticism of this lecture. It's actually really good, and I recommend you see the whole thing. But if you don't have time for the whole thing, you can have time for the supercut, and it's a lecture also hosted by the Department of Digital Humanities on doubt. So you get a sense of how this works. Anyway, so you get the idea, right? So what obviously, oops, no, that's not me. So the idea of the supercut is precisely that you can somehow sample. Is a way of thinking, and it's a way of doing, which is not that dissimilar to how a data scientist might approach certain things, which is by sampling. So they try to ascertain what the lecture was about by, in this case, what the tool does is obviously you pick up some words on specific terms, and it will count the number of instances, and it will try to produce the supercut. Now, to go back to the idea, this is obviously reductive, and this is obviously flattening some of the richness of the lecture, but it does also tell you something else in the hope that you learn something new or something different about the lecture. So taking this idea forward in terms of film and the moving image, so I scraped a collection called movie clips, which some of you may be familiar with. So these are just collections of clips that are on YouTube about condensed movies. So you have like 10 clips from a movie and they're from a film, and they're organized in chronological order. So you can watch, quote unquote, watch a film as if it was supercut for you. It will take you like maybe 10-15 minutes, and you can follow the plot and watch the whole thing. And I'm guilty of this. I've seen many films in this way because I don't want to bother with the whole thing. And so the supercut kind of cuts both ways. It's a way of watching, it's a way of thinking, but it's also a way of making. So I was thinking if it's possible to do this in a different way or in a more sophisticated way. So we talked about some of these techniques that we can use. So in this case, I use emotion recognition from faces, and I wanted to see if I could approximate some of the complexities of some of the shots by calculating or trying to infer the emotional state of the characters using this method, but also combining this with a different type of feature, which is just the shot scale, which is a very straightforward process in which you just calculate the shot scale based on the face and how big the face is in relation to the whole screen or to the whole frame size. And so the idea was to use a formal element and an emotional element and combine them to see if I could come up with a supercut that made sense. So I came up with this idea, which is big angry faces. So I'll play a little bit of it and see if that makes sense. So these are the parameters. So this is edited automatically. Automatically once the system is working. And these are extreme close-ups of angry people.
Fuck your grandma! Let me go!
Is that positive?
God don't fire! And I'll be hanged. More less word! Put down more fluff!
You want me to say Catherine? I'm sorry.
Anyway, you get the idea. So this is the sort of and we also have metadata on all of these clips, of course, and how, even how many times they have seen and so on. So, but what I want to touch on in terms of this, so this obviously kind of, in some senses, trivial examples of how to do this and how to try to implement some of the fantasies of the film theories that I quoted earlier. But also, I want to talk a little bit more about the modalities of inquiry and the ways, the styles of knowledge that we have for dealing with these things. And traditionally, we have thought about some of these categories as object and subject-oriented epistemologies or ways of knowledge or ways of styles of knowing something, right? So in terms of the objects, we have technical worlds that tend to be systematic, trying to be systematized and systematic, universal. They try to be effective, and they're about analysis and analytics. And I think this speaks to the first moment that Nanne was arguing about, the distant viewing part of it. So he's trying to look at all of these objects under this light as objects. But then you also have the other very strong traditions on subject-oriented epistemologies, which tend to be much more concerned with individuals, with humans, with contingency, with things that don't happen all the time, but that can happen one time and be really important, which is a little bit also what some of the previous discussions considered. They also tend to consider emotions and affect in these moving images, but they're also quite synthetic. This has been historically a division, which my argument and the thing that I want to pose to you today is that some of the AI technologies that we are seeing now are putting a lot of pressure in this division, on this type of division. It isn't clear anymore that we can separate these two things neatly, and it isn't clear that we should study them from these two perspectives separately. So what I'm trying to get at here is that we are going from this moment in which we had film and media studies plus computer and data science, or data science and computer science methods applied to film and applied to moving image collections, to a place where we can talk about computational moving images as a coherent whole, that an object of a study, but also a way with which to study moving images. No, so and this is where the high-dimensional cinema thing comes in. So to clarify this idea, this happened also in other areas, for example, in computational social science, which again went through this phase of being, social science with a bit of computing or with applied computing techniques into its own identity as computational social science. So I think we are probably on the brink of having this thing of computational moving images as a field that is opening up. And the reason we suspect this might be a field as well, I suppose we can talk about this more during the conversation, is that there are new questions that we are able to ask because of this practice. And so what I want to end up and finish on the applications and implications are two things that interest me and that I've been working on recently after this paper, which is the emergence of synthetic media and generative approaches in computational humanities. This basically tries to answer this question: how to incorporate computer models or computational models and the forms of synthesis and synthetic media that they produce as tools and objects of research in humanities computing. And I think part of the reason why I see these things as putting enormous pressure in the object-subject distinction is because when you think about synthesis and how you have text prompts that then can lead to image generation, then you are already mixing these two worlds. You are drawing from culture, but you're also drawing from computing almost in an indistinguishable way, or it's becoming more difficult to distinguish every time. So thinking about this, I was also thinking what to do with my data set, or what would be the next thing to do after that paper. And I was thinking about synthetic data in this sense. So what you see on top is a frame from I think one of the latest versions of Blade Runner. And you might be familiar with text-to-image generation because it's been on the news and it's quite recent, as well. But you might be less familiar with the fact that this can also be reversed. So you have some tools like Clip Interrogator that tries to infer the prompt that was used to generate a specific image. So these things can work both ways. So my thinking for the next kind of experimental phase of this type of research would be to run some clip generator on the frames of films, and then using that to generate new frames to create new images, like the one you see on the right. Of course, there is a lot of loss between these two things. But if you keep doing this and you iterate over it, eventually the image completely degrades and completely changes, and it gets lost, right? So it's like taking photocopies of a photocopy over and over again. At some point, it stops making sense. But what we do get, or what we could get potentially, is a signal or a measure of how iconic some of these things are. And by iconic, what I mean is how well understood or how well represented they are in the models that look at these things. So you get a measure of that, a signal of that. And I think in some senses what we've been discussing today and this morning is these two worlds coming together at a point where we also need to include the types of reasoning that media scholars use and tend to use when they are exploring these things. And to finish up, this would be the core aspect of what I want to present to you today, is that this needs to be done in practice as well. So we need to, in many ways, in order to theorize some of these things, we also need to work through them. And there is an element of learning on several disciplines of how to work together, and this isn't easy, and this is what we're grappling with today and tomorrow at the workshop. So this is kind of where this thinking has led. How am I doing with time? Is that okay? Out of time. Okay, I'm sorry. So that's it. Thank you.
a bit more than half an hour for discussion, questions, and queries you may have, or aspects you may want to seek clarification. Okay. I wonder if there are any questions, or shall I start with a general question? I mean, it struck me from your different projects and different aspects. I mean, Daniel, you mentioned automatization. And what struck me is, coming from film studies, that the questions we're grappling with are also very long-term historical questions that were coming from semiotics, from genre semantics, from historical poetics. Film scholars, film historians were trying to grapple with these things, but also in a very manual, kind of labor-intensive way. It seems that this new era of computational science is bringing the ability to kind of to work with much larger data set. But it's all a question of the qualitative moving to the quantitative. Can you elaborate a bit more in your own research, how this is not just changing kind of the data sets we're working with, but actually the actual research questions that are coming into light are now slightly different or modified by the contact of computation analysis with moving image media? I mean, you may want to give very specific examples or more general reflection.
I can go first. I think so. One of the so in terms of automating some of this work, I think it's important to recognize that automation is never really free, in the sense that it comes at a labor cost. Only that labor is very often hidden away, or it has been pre-done. So by the time you get to these type of models, much of this work has already taken place. So when you're thinking about how some of these things in computational poetics, which is a bit closer to me, some of these measurements of shot lengths were done in the past, you had people like Barry Salt actually using celluloid and cutting the number of frames and trying and measure how many frames per shot, and then doing this type of very manual database. And his work is amazing from that point of view. A person spent their whole lives doing this sort of thing that we can now do with shot boundary detection with not much effort. Of course, without that previous work, this other work may have been quite different as well. But the labor part is in terms of models comes in also obviously at the labeling aspect of the data set production of the models. And what has changed, I suppose, is that the ability to store them in a computational stable artifact that then you can just move someplace else and release at a different time, at a different point. So is that this ability of storing storage of these things, and it's almost like a videotape sort of thing that you can move around and you can create markets for it, sell, buy, and all sorts of things. That I think is what the ability of compressed labor and of putting labor into these models and then release it at will is what's probably quite specific about this type of technology, I would imagine. So anyway, that's more like my thinking about automation in that sense.
Yeah, so for me, I think it very directly impacts the sort of research questions that I try to work on. I think for me, learning more about sort of semiotics works helps me to realize that some of the computational approaches that we're trying to do are fundamentally sort of wrong in the assumptions that we're making. So a lot of these like very powerful now like image generation models or like text description models, you really make a strong assumption that if you see something together in the wild, then they mean the same thing. So if you have an image and some text that describes it, then they mean the same thing. And that works very well for this example where I showed like a bedroom with a description because, well, that description was made to match that image. But if you open any newspaper and you look at the image with the text below it, they don't express the same exact thing. So there's like some information difference there where the combination of that image and that text leads to like a new interpretation. And that's very different from how we now can model it in sort of machine learning in general and how I think we should be modeling it. And I think that leads to like very interesting ground for me to like, okay, we have this understanding as people of how we work with this. There's a lot of literature on this in semiotics. How does this then translate to a model that actually captures this in some way? and often we just don't know yet, but that's I think for me where the most exciting things happen is because we sort of slowly make our way towards that. And I think that's kind of like every time where we see we do make progress in coming up with new ways of trying to tackle these problems.
Yeah, for me, maybe coming from or trained as hardcore close reader and qualitative scholar, and then moving towards like more computational and cultural data analytics, I think the kind of like the most important thing that I have learned that we actually, in order to really understand some kind of like hardcore like cultural phenomena and such, I think we need to have both qualitative and quantitative approaches together, and that's also I think that's one of the like the very interesting and important facts of our workshop that we are having here is that we are people from different disciplines coming together and trying to discuss certain phenomena together and how to solve them, because I think that sometimes for instance people from the humanities or social sciences might have some research questions that are kind of like very important for understanding culture, but then kind of like we need the computational side and this mathematics side to in order to be able to model it, and then in order to then interpret the what is the meaning of those results that we get, then we again need some maybe social sciences and so it is really kind of like that I think we definitely need both. And what has been kind of like, this is interesting question, what kinds of maybe new research questions have emerged. Of course, one of the self-evident answers for me as a cultural historian is that by using computational methods I can study longer time spans. It's not only taking and also not only taking samples, but really exploring all of the data. It's really interesting, and it also kind of like, I think that what is the benefit for that is that if I have all the data and I do kind of like computational analysis on that, it kind of like gives me contextualization of the phenomenon, not only based on kind of like other literature that I'm reading, but also contextualization based on the data. So I can understand whether this particular phenomenon that I'm interested in, whether it's kind of like, very general, or whether it's a niche but very interesting topic for me. So that's kind of like something new that I get from using like big data and computational methods. And another thing that I have understood is that we really need to understand what units of analysis we are studying and what is actually what they are telling to us. So if I'm analyzing, so kind of like certain features of the data, so I need to understand to what kind of like research question it actually answers. So this is kind of like, this needs also kind of like conversations and dialogues between different disciplines.
I think also actually it's a project that I work now on with two of the colleagues also in the room, where so I'm from Amsterdam, and we looked at like Dutch cinema, and one of the things around Dutch cinema is that it has this reputation of having a lot of nudity in it, and like quite explicit. And we were curious, like, can we verify this in some way? And I think that really brought this interesting question. First off, like automatic detection of nudity is in computer science is a way of filtering out content to make sure that it's child safe. And now we were like, can we repurpose this same technology to actually try to find something that we're interested in? But then also it brings up lots of questions, like what is nudity? Like where do you draw the line? Like different countries interpret it very differently. And also the computational sort of gives a different answer because we're counting sort of occurrences of nudity. But when talking about it, we're like, yeah, but sensors actually kind of use more intensity of nudity, sort of like how explicit is it? And that's also like where you have to have this interaction between sort of like actually looking at it and being like, okay, it is like quite explicit, or it's like actually very innocent, and like discounting for a movie, how much is there? And I think that's like questions that we wouldn't have, as computer scientists, never would have even thought about asking without trying to have this dialogue between the disciplines.
If I can comment on that, so from the humanities, there is also an element of value and of how these things are valuable or become valuable because of the types of data that we can inject or reconfigure. So the issue of value came up today as well with the archives people, with the BFI and the BBC people, because they're well, it's really some of these things are really expensive to keep, and there is also taxpayers' money that goes into keeping them. And so we how do we know if we throw up, if we throw away the top of the pops and we keep the the documentary, and this is a political economy of value and of the things that get preserved and then they watch over time for history and for generations to come. And I think we're coming now to a point where we realize that we didn't know how valuable they were until we up to this moment where we know that they can become enriched with different types of data that come from different directions, and all of a sudden you get something that seemed valuable to some people, to our researchers, working on their PhD for somewhere, and so all of a sudden you can get, actually no, this might be valuable for a country as a resource. And it's incredible how some of these resources how governments have been not very good at giving, some of them have been giving away some of these resources because they see them as burdens. As we have to keep a national archive, and this is expensive and it's not, but actually wealth might be there as well for national wealth in terms of culture. So it is understanding that this value is not going to be easy to extract as if it was, is understanding what makes this value possible is a construction rather than an extraction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, data creates new context and changes our understanding of value, which is super interesting. I think there's already a question from...
Mila, my name is Brian Cotton. Hello. Mila, I was really struck by your work. Did you use the pre-trained ResNet 50 model?
Yes, yes.
So you used the pre-trained
That's
version
correct.
to do your own training?
Yeah.
Okay, and that was my question. My observation of that is, I don't think you've got a Perestroika problem. I think you've got a Perestroika feature recognition.
Yeah.
So, and that, based on personal experience, I was doing my PhD in 1989, and I was on one of the first Western scientific missions to the Soviet Union, because the war was still up there. And we went to Akademgorodok, which was a secret academic city near Novosibirsk. And we were there about 3 weeks. And in the period we were there, the whole quality of Russian news media changed completely. So it was Gorbachev on the telly every day talking about glasnost. We got taken by one of our hosts to see a hunger strike protest in the center of Novosibirsk, which was all about supporting Perestroika and the change. And it was noticeable how different things became. And I just speculate you might actually have, I don't think you've got a Perestroika problem at all. I think the neural net has picked up some kind of complex change in media language, which possibly wasn't there before the whole process of glasnost began. So it would be quite interesting to look at the temporal dimensions of your image classification and see if you can relate that back to political activity at the time in the way in which the Soviet Union was changing. And if you wanted another data set to work on, you could look at all the images around the Arab Spring recently. Because the quality of social media changed. I was doing social media analysis around that, mostly using Twitter tools in the days when Twitter was actually useful. And we picked up some signals from Twitter prior to all the demonstrations that happened in Egypt, for example. There were precursor signals in the social media data that we were able to recognize, which then led to the realization that actually those things preceded activity on the ground. And so I think, I don't think we've got a problem at all. I think that's a stunning result, potentially.
I'm very happy if you think so. And also, actually, as we have been doing also other types of analysis for this data, so Perestroika period is clearly visible not only within the images, but also the shot length, the topics that are covered, the geographical concentration. It becomes really kind of like focused on internal issues. Also, you can see it in kind of like number of newsreels done. You can see it on the staff in that sense, that the number of people working on newsreels, but also the gender balance is kind of like shifting. So there are a lot of different kinds of changes that I also kind of like hope that this would be, but of course I need to look at it more closely, because one of the things that, as I have been watching these newsreels, I can see that suddenly in the Perestroika period there are not anymore kind of like these bold workers and smiling faces, but they are kind of like concentrating on problems and maybe kind of like, so they might be that they have some different kinds of posters and I actually discussed with one of my colleagues that if this happens that we don't have a Perestroika problem but a feature, then it would be interesting to continue looking at further maybe like Russian television news and what kinds of posters there are, and whether we would be able to detect the increasing kind of like concentration of power and diminishing freedom of speech and stuff in what has been happening recently. So, but there, it's super interesting and
I wonder whether a test you could do is to take your existing image set, extract all the Perestroika images that you've identified, then use what's left, a subset of what's left as training data for a res layer network, train that on your own Soviet-related data, and then see what it does when you include the Perestroika images. What classification would it make of those? How would it resolve those into something that works?
Yes.
And that it will be a way of test, a kind of blind test in a way of whether it's a Perestroika feature or a Perestroika problem.
That's true. Yeah.
Yes, please.
So thanks, amazing presentations, and I come from corporate background, so I'm working with Gen AI and stuff, so that's why I'm interested in this too, because I think people working in my field needs to understand the complexity, the use cases, and various things. So as a researcher from great universities, how do you feel the trajectory should work? For example, all the examples were given, I was thinking of, there is a use case for Netflix, there is a use case for YouTube, there is a use case for television and media, and also to pick up on political unrest from just the examples which was being discussed. So there are actual real-life examples, or like job applications or job profiles, like video editing, which take hours, time shortage. There are so many things. So how do you think researchers and the enterprises working together? Because I think this is a junction where it's becoming very, very crucial. It cannot be silos. It needs to come together. So just thoughts on that.
So maybe I can start. At Tallinn University at Kudan, we have been struggling with this a little bit because we actually started to work during COVID. So the initial plan was to have more contacts, not only within academia, but also with different kinds of memory institutions, also corporations, and so on and so forth. But now we are trying to kind of do more of this. So this fall we are going to start kind of having these kinds of conversations and inviting people from different organizations to talk with us. So this is something that we see that is important, but so far we haven't been able to do that fully. But I really think that the first step is to get together in the same room and to discuss and kind of see what are the different approaches from different institutions.
If I can maybe follow up on that, it is I think also we have to recognize that some of the problems and some of the difficulties of working together as well. I think this is we love to think about interdisciplinary approaches and about people coming from different places and all working harmoniously together, but this is a lot harder than in practice than it is in theory. So there is a sense of we not only of working together across disciplines but also across institutions, which is also, I think, the other challenge that we have when you say use cases for corporate entities or for archives, as we did in the morning, or governments or so on. And I think it's the recognition that so in the humanities, for example, there is also sometimes some despair about how big corporate players monopolize data and fence off opportunities and so on. But it's, I think, also a case to be made, or for universities to be much smarter as to how they operate in this space and in this environment. So we were saying earlier, so for example, to take a different kind of example, the large language model things that is now in the news very often, you get like big companies that have the compute resources and the data resources to do them and to exploit them, but you also increasingly get partnerships between universities, governments, and private entities that can create similar models and models that compete. So this defeatist attitude that we will never be able to catch up with big tech in terms of what they're doing, effective in the sense that there is a so long as we learn to work together and to work with others. But this is where the challenge lies, in my view, which isn't a straightforward thing. It isn't obvious. The answers are never as obvious as we think, but it is possible to compete in that space, and it is possible to come up with larger ideas. I think we've given up on large ideas, and I think this is what we want to recover, perhaps.
Just to add on that, the LLM model which you just mentioned, for corporations, especially for example if you're working for telecom data, where customer data is very, very crucial and needs to be seen. So we were, like, from a security perspective, as an example, we will ensure that the data is safe because there are legal implications. Obviously, we go for data centers situated in the countries, for example, Europe, Nordics have very, very stringent laws, and as it should be. So we have those private cloud and sector. So it can be protected, and we are working vigorously to do that. But if it comes together with the implications like this, it's like happening in silos. As I obviously, like from the things I'm seeing or the forums I'm going. So I feel personally that's why I'm here, to have something outside it, but I got so many questions to do, I was taking notes, that the things which is coming in, we talk about responsible AI a lot, that's the first thing, like our organization or Microsoft or we are talking about, but then no one mentions about the humanities and the social sciences or the impact on that deeper level, which I think happens in more of a research area, which needs to flow into the people making the, like for example, we have corporate goals already within the organization, big tech and all, but there should be people representing from research academy outside because of big organizations have researchers of their own, esteemed researchers, but they are still on their payroll, right? So I feel like the independent people and organizations, that's my 2 cents. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm another postgraduate research teams here. Just a question of if you come across anything in relation to using audio description scripts files as a way of enriching the image recognition. Just kind of thinking about the descriptive elements that describing and identifying emotion or tension or scene description as well, rather than that physical positioning of flowing into the narrative. And in particular, I think about the Queen's funeral and the King's coronation, where the BBC had a commentated in an audio described version of exactly the same coverage, which is giving you 3 layers of
So we're actually working on a project where we're trying to use like the sort of the audio descriptions of visually impaired people of movies And there's kind of this existing task of like that you have like some sentence that describes a certain moment in the film, and then the idea is that you train the model by trying to retrieve that exact moment, because then if you that sort of like tries to solve this alignment problem. But I think that's also again where we come into this problem, is that this is the existing task is sort of done only on one film, and then you actually lose a lot of the context of like, for example, who the director was will make a difference if you do this across films. So that's one of the steps we're now trying to make. Like if you use these descriptions over larger sets of data, it changes what you need to put into search, because like two people having a conversation on a roof looks different in a high budget versus a low budget movie. But we definitely are using these other descriptions.
I suppose, yeah, I would add that the promise of multi-modality and to have and just embed everything and hope that something comes out of it is also, you know, it's an interesting approach, but it's also very difficult in a different sense. I think we've been exploring ways in which we get signals that are a lot simpler in a way and a lot easier to get. But that may come from unexpected places, for example, or that may be combined. It's maybe more of a future engineering sort of thing. That if we combine a couple of specific types of signals, we can get something much more interesting. And this is where, to go back to a little bit to the question of value and how valuable, we don't always know beforehand what this is going to be. So sometimes, you know, you find some interesting correlation. We were talking earlier about meaningful objects as a way of, as a proxy for dating films or for dating moving image material, because if we can identify the first time that mobile phones were used on a screen, for example, then you get some form of sense of, and this is something that we can do now, and we don't really need like this, like massively sophisticated types of embed everything approach. We can actually do a lot of interesting things if we change the assumptions of the types of outputs that we want. So if we change the target, we figure out that some of these problems maybe are almost solved already. Like some of these things are a lot easier to do than we may think, because the target that we're giving what is different in that sense. No? So just to kind of elaborate on that example, we are, I think the three of us, also interested in this notion of aesthetically sensitive systems. Of systems that are a bit more sensitive to how people watch and feel about these images, as opposed to what the images depict. Because this is the goalpost for that was very specific and was very, you know, is very much about production of value in kind of capitalist society and so on. But when you think about it, you don't go around the world looking at objects and saying what they are. This is a really strange behavior. And yet this is the goal that was set for that specific task, and at that it works. Kind of, right? But if we change the goal, if we say actually the goal is not to name objects or to come, but actually to, for example, this morning we're discussing to try to understand how people experience time or how people experience rhythm, for instance, in moving images. And rhythm, it turns out we don't need, you know, we have already some things that can tell us and can provide a good signal for that experience of moving images. So we, you know, is changing those goals that also matters, as well as finding the data then that comes with you know, that we need in order to get to those goals. I mean, I'm sure that doesn't really answer your question, Simon, but it is yeah. I sometimes feel like we have different data sets, right? And we all want to try to work with them, but it's probably also thinking about what we want them for, which is, I think, the other question.
Yes.
Thank you so much. As someone who's also working with computational methods for film analysis, I think also getting back to your initial question about what are the big research questions that we can ask that are perhaps a little bit new even. I think what drew me to those at first is the possibility of getting away from the canon right? Which I think if you're doing close reading, you know, that's mostly what ends up happening. It's like, oh, really try to look at other things and go bigger in terms of timeline, as you also mentioned, Mila. But I've also found myself kind of without meaning to going back to more canonical works, because often it's what you can have access to. So I was wondering, or not as, maybe canonical is the wrong word there, but it's still like, it's not the you know, most marginal film cultures and things like that that you can get access to. When you're talking about computational methods as well, there's problems of bias with the algorithms and what they were trained on in the first place. So I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about that and how that affects your work.
So for me, I think one of the entry points to try to think about these problems in a different way were actually iconic images, which are like these photographs that are very well known. So you have like the Vietnamese war image of like the napalm girl, which is like this very exemplary image. And for me, that was a really good way of starting to think about what can we do with the technology that we now have in doing something meaningful with this image. And then especially if you think of like trying to detect the object in this image, that seems a very crude way to approach that image. And this is similarly from the Vietnam War. There's an image that's called the Saigon execution, which is like a moment that somebody is being like shot on the street. And if you run that through like this sort of object detector, it misses the gun, which is kind of crucial for that image. And actually there's like, Google has like these tools that they offer publicly where you also can get like some other scores. And the facial expression of that person at that moment is kind of like grimacing, I guess, due to the reaction of being shot. But then it gets a very high score for fun, that image, which seems not so appropriate. So for me, it was really like eye-opening of like, okay, we're not only like not understanding this image, we're actually like very much misinterpreting. And I think that's where like some of these canonical examples actually can be very useful, because there are sort of known interpretations of them, and they are a good starting point to reflect to other types of knowledge that we have. Whereas if we take random images from the internet, we get something wrong of them. Most of the time it's not really that bad, right? It's like we have these typical examples of bias where things go wrong, but oftentimes it doesn't really matter so much if it's like slightly wrong. And I think for these kind of canonical cases, because we know what's going on and because they're historically significant, it actually helps us to understand how wrong we are and what we should be solving.
Yeah, I think that yeah, there are these biases, especially if you're working with historical data, and kind of like how does if you are using like object detection, how well does it work with like historical data, and also like certain meaning. So if you have if you have a horse in newsreels in 1920s and a horse in newsreels in 1990s, it has a little bit different weight in a way because of the time difference. So, and this is of course kind of like you need to somehow have that understanding of when you are kind of like looking at these results that you are getting. One of the things that I think is also important is kind of like also absences that you kind of like have to take into account. I remember when I started to watch kind of like manually, or I don't know how to call it, watch by myself these newsreels. I was thinking that it's interesting that there are not many depictions of Stalin, although we have coverage from the late 1940s, early 1950s, before his death. And then only later, as I started to look at what is the structure of the data, actually we have systematic data starting from 1954 after his death, and it's clearly de-Stalinized, this kind of like this. So these newsreels with depictions of Stalin have been removed from there. So that's one example of kind of like maybe to need to look at like with different features to try to detect also these kind of like absences there. Yeah.
Yeah, I would add to that, for example, that there's a so the humanities and critical thinking about moving images doesn't necessarily have a monopoly on absent things and on contingent things, right? So if you think about it in terms of data, one of the interesting aspects is that you can infer what's missing by what's there. If you design a space in which you have in which you know certain things are canonical and can be identified, you can also use that in order to understand what's not there to an extent, because then you can have right. In my kind of Hollywood examples, one of the things that I would like to do is to do a bit of a Hollywood detector, if you want, so that we can run it over images to see how Hollywood-like they are. But that allows you to identify the ones that are least Hollywood ones, and that allows you to isolate them a little bit, like Mila was showing as well. And that itself can become another data set that can help you to bring forth the marginal non-canonical cases, and maybe actually give them significance that they didn't have before this type of processing. And I suppose the other thing that I can comment on top of that is this notion of a similarity and two ways of thinking about this. And this is kind of my aesthetics kind of mindset working here. But you have this need for explanations, which tend to be linear and tend to be much more time-based, because the types of relationships between units are time-oriented. So we were discussing earlier, if you change the order of things, meaning changes, right? But then you also have these space-oriented now kind of ways of apprehending these things, in which proximities are what matters. So when Mila was plotting the things, is the fact that you can, in a data projection, you can plot them as being together, and there is something similar about them. And the something similar can be trivial, but it can also be really telling, or it can be, it can be a product of bias. But even that would be an interesting thing to look at from the point of view of these proximities. But proximities they're not really great at explaining anything. You're just trying to. They're great at retrieval, for example. So if you understand something that's close to something else, then retrieval becomes an option. But they're not really great at providing explanations for those proximities. For that, you need something a little bit more like narrative. So telling stories about why these proximities exist or do not exist. So these two ways of thinking are kind of come together in the. So we need the proximities, but also we need the narratives to explain the proximities. So it's understanding that there are biases, but also the narratives to understand why these biases exist, or actually fleshing them out would be another opportunity. And it's not like close reading is not very canonical about these things too, right? So the reification of certain types of media, it happens both in close reading as well as in distant reading. It's probably not so much an aspect of the type of work, but an aspect of our own desire to reduce and explain and narrate things by using instances, kind of iconic instances or exemplaries in order to extrapolate. So what I'm saying is maybe it's more of a cognitive bias as well as a data bias, and as well as so these two interact in the designing of the systems, I would say.
I think I have time for one final question. Over there, yeah.
I'm a student at the Digital Humanities Department. I think it's very interesting. Like most of you are talking about how we've used quantitative methods to speed up the study of qualitative questions and somehow discover a new perspective on the things that you're studying. But I also feel like it's very interesting how you could trace it back into the qualitative things. Like you were discovering how human perception works, for example, how we perceive like images, what is important in an image, what are the important connotations in the image. Like that reminds me of how like cultural scholars was hinting at in the 20th century perhaps, Roland Barthes in the photographic message. He was talking about how like compositions and elements in the image could influence how we perceive the image, but there were no hard evidence of that. And it was very interesting to see, like, in all of your studies, you were discovering, like, what sort of elements in an image could be the elements that he was talking about, and, like, which elements are more important, which elements are less influential, and that's just very interesting to me, I think. What do you think about that?
Maybe I can just comment. I really thank you for this comment. I think this is very, very important. And I kind of like really agree that when we are using computational methods, it actually kind of like directs us back to these questions of core humanities as well. So it's kind of like a circle. I'm currently finalizing an article where we are actually discussing this phenomenon, how to, when you are analyzing film or newsreels, then you are selecting certain units of analysis to study, but then in order to really understand what these units of analysis tell you, you also need to think about what actually makes film, what are the meaning-making elements of a film in order to be able to say whether these units of analysis really make sense or really match my research questions. So, yeah, I really liked your comment. Thank you. Yeah.
I think for me there's also like this very interesting tension, because most of machine learning works because we divide things into categories, and then we try to just see, okay, how can we map sort of the visual thing we have to that category. And in interacting with people from the humanities, often what I get back is that they don't like to categorize things because you lose complexity that way. So there's this, but at the same time, we run into the fact that if you never categorize, you can sort of almost never move forward, because we need this to make the technology work. And I think for me, the interesting tension then is like, how do we sort of compromise on that, where we either have correct categories that kind of capture the phenomena in a good way, or maybe we can somehow have the categories slightly open, that we leave some margin for error. And I think that leads to this interesting interaction. And I think that's where these disciplines are very much also can complement each other, because, like you said, there was a lot of research on doing these things in the past, but often it wasn't codified in any way that there was evidence for it. And for me, that is a way to verify that I'm sort of doing the correct things. If I'm finding something, it's like, hey, this matches up with what was found there and then. So that shows that from two different ways we got to the same answer, so then probably more likely to be correct.
Yeah, I suppose just one thing to add to that is that there's also an aspect of this type of work which is revising one's assumptions. And I think this is quite interesting when you engage in a discipline that's not your own, and you start trying to work with the methods and through the methods of others. It also forces you to revise many of your initial assumptions, and this is very valuable as well, right? Because then again, you discover that your discipline did not have the monopoly on certain things that you thought it had the monopoly on, and then you realize, for example, discipline like physics or like mathematical modeling, they have been dealing with uncertainty for a long time, and with they also they can categorize, but also they can refuse to categorize until they have a working model. So it's not like we are alone in thinking about some of these problems, and I think discovering this is quite a good side effect, if you want, or maybe the main effect of working, trying to work through the disciplines of others and through the different eyes, I suppose. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
I think we need
one tiny thing, because I think recursively what it does is that it makes you think back towards how intuition actually forms work, that forms knowledge. So it's kind of two knowledge systems speaking to each other.
Just I have a question for Mila, if there's time. To what extent do you think of newsreels as film, or not at all?
Sorry, so
to what extent, or do you think of newsreels as film, or not at all?
I think they are film, but they are, I think them as a film, but also as news.
Yeah, sure.
And in the cases that I study, mostly propaganda as well.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, but at the intersection is interesting.
Yeah, it is.
One thing I could comment maybe to cap that off is that we are very ecumenical about, so we're saying moving images, and with the full knowledge that there are many histories that coalesce into this large umbrella category, right? So but we like to be ecumenical, I guess.
Thank you.
That's great. I think on that note, we will have to finish off. Please join me in thanking our panel. Excellent. Thanks everybody for being here today and participating. Yeah.